unmute.
Sorry. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for being here today. My name is Megan Steelstra. I'm thrilled to be here with these incredibly brilliant women. I'm a little bit in awe of all of them. The way that we're going to roll today is that we're each going to give some kind of brief opening remarks, and then we'll dig into a little conversation about what it means to write from the body to each one of us. I'm especially excited by the description of this particular conversation, which talked about what it means to dig deeply into one's internal organs. And so just as I was preparing these remarks, I walked around like trying to think about what my insides looked like. I don't know, like welcome to the TMI aspect of this particular conversation. And it made me think of the 2 years I spent dissecting deer hearts to make a particular essay. So if you really want to talk about your organs, I'm happy to do so. Anyway, I'm gonna kick us off. So it was the end of my first semester of college in Boston. I was in the dorm studying for finals, getting ready to fly home for the holidays. Someone knocked on my door then, stuck their head into my room and said, "Hey, aren't you from Chelsea, Michigan?" My high school was on the news. There was a baseball field where my dad and I played catch, the library where I'd wait if he had a board meeting. There were cop cars in the parking lot. School shooting, said the newscaster. Unknown fatalities. And later, one fatality. They didn't name names, of course. Only this: the victim was a local school administrator. This was before cell phones, before voicemail and call waiting and all of us on the internet all the goddamn time. Everything's so fast now. Fear and speculation scrolling through our feeds. But back then it was slow. We had time to wait. No one was home at my parents' house and I couldn't get through on their work lines. I paced my dorm room, listening to the busy signal. In the absence of information, imagination fills in the blanks. A board meeting, maybe, one of the countless I'd attended as the principal's kid. My dad would be sitting at the conference table in his suit and tie. His friend, Joe Pisecki, the superintendent, would be there too, and the elementary school principals, maybe some teachers and parents. Was the shooter already in the room? Did he burst in later? How many guns did he have? How many rounds? Where was my father? Under the conference table, down the hall? Did he put his body in front of the bullets? We learn to fear our own imagination. 5 hours went by before I heard his voice. 5 hours before I knew he was okay. Maybe that doesn't sound like long, but imagine what can happen to a body in even 10 small seconds. 1,000, 2, 1,000, 3. Imagine what can happen to a heart. It's easy to think about this story through the lens of relief. It didn't happen to my dad, to my family, my community, my city, my country. It's always somewhere else, right? But it did happen. Joe Pisecki lost his life that day. His daughter, Nicole, my friend, lost her dad. There are real human beings behind the statistics, and our work is to find the language for the complicated, fucked up, messy goddamn joy of the human experience. The essayist Kiese Lehman writes, "What does the body remember?" I am 45 years old now, and I can still feel those 5 hours in my bones. The fear, the relief, the guilt at my relief, and the shit spiral I go down whenever there's a mass shooting in this country. So as you might imagine, there is a lot of spiraling. And that's what we write about, right? What hurts us, challenges us, changes us, moves us, fucks us up. And I've written about gun violence in 1,000 different ways: straight up data-driven reportage, policy-backed op-ed, fiction, personal essay, poetry, which is really bad because I am not a poet, even humor, which weirdly enough is what got me the most, let's say, feedback from dudes on the internet. Sidebar, dudes, don't be that dude. Dude, if you see that dude on the internet, will you please tell him to stop? We need you. I need you. I have a son. I collect stories of men being awesome and I show them to my little boy and I say, this is how we are going to be in this beautiful mess of a world. Anyhow, whenever I write about gun violence or any of the subjects I write about, postpartum depression, crying on Zoom, Chicago politics, reproductive justice, dissecting deer hearts, competitive axe throwing, and all sorts of other weird and wonderful things, the question I always ask myself is this: am I writing from the body or am I writing from the head? Or am I putting it all in a blender and seeing what flies out? I ask myself, do I want to put you there? Or do I want to tell you about it? Do I want to give you scene and data? Or do I want to give you scene or data? I guess is more appropriate. What is it that I want to give you? How do I want to move you? And what publication am I writing this for? I come at this work from a performance background, and directors that I would always work with would say, what is our contract with the audience? What does the audience walk into this space expecting to find, and how can I still find myself within that? And I think about that all of the time when I'm considering the publications I write for. How I approach work that I do for the New York Times is very different than how I approach work from the Onion, for the Onion, because the audience is coming at those particular publications for very different things. And I want to be able to speak to that audience and connect with them in that way. So that will push my questions of whether or not I'm coming from the body too. And one final thought that I want to throw out about this: sometimes it feels safer to me to write from the head. When I write about what happened to my dad, I want to give you statistics about school shootings in this country. I don't want to tell you that after this shooting, he quit his job and sold our house and moved to a very small island in the middle of the Gulf of Alaska where he is currently a salmon fisherman. Just because you survive something doesn't mean you're not still haunted. Thanks.
Wow. Thank you, Megan. That was incredible. Haunting. I'm going to read a little bit from my book. This is One Way to Dance. And I'm going to read a little bit from 2 craft essays. So I'm going to read from the beginning of my book. I had an introduction. I was asked to write an introduction. It's a book of essays. And then I have an opening poem of sorts called Prelude. So this is Prelude. Sajal, I am trying to describe what it feels like. There is nothing but space in these words. When language fractures in your attempt to speak, when you are trying to talk back. Here is my booth at the carnival. What will stay and what will go, Indian, American, and girl. The body, bones, raced, erased. There are 2 semicolons now, and there were some earlier, and there were also some open brackets. Stories are an argument between some words. Sajal. Weddings are a circle of stories, our bodies, streets, intersections. This is the body dancing. I am a triple threat, semicolon, semicolon. My mother speaks to me in Gujarati, my father in the other room reading. These 2 words were once linked by a hyphen. But that is not the answer. I answer her, usually in English. The space blooming now, breaking now. There is no answer, semicolon. There is only a door. Is widening now. I too call myself I. Sajal. Words are surfacing. One way to dance. And Prelude was taken from an earlier draft of another essay in this book called Introductions. Well, no, now it's called Matrimonials. It was the introduction to my MFA thesis 19 years ago. But I was trying to keep something of the feeling. I was someone who'd grown up studying dance. I'd grown up in a multilingual household. And I wanted to keep something of those spaces. And I had my name in here in Gujarati. So if you don't read the notes at the back, you won't know what it, and you don't know Gujarati, you wouldn't be able to read it. I don't know if you can actually see that. Not very well. But I wanted to keep the presence of this other language, of my other language, in a book that was in English. So I wrote about that a little bit in, I wrote a couple of craft essays in the months before my book came out last year for poets and writers. And I'm so grateful to that for that experience, because it gave me a chance to really kind of dig in and think about the choices that I had made. And so one of them is called Feel Your Way, and it's about studying dance. So there's a little bit, oops, I forgot to put on my timer. Hold on, I'm just gonna try it anyway. I'll take off some minutes. After the front matter in my book is an opening poem, a prologue. I called it Prelude after the piece Prelude, Discipline is Freedom, a dance choreographed by the artist Garth Fagan many years ago, a piece I grew up seeing. And Garth Fagan is a Jamaican-American choreographer who's based in Rochester, New York, where I grew up. The dance is an invocation of sorts with parts of a dance class woven within. The repetition of fundamental movements, foundational exercises, for floor sequences, 4 women passing here, 4 men there, now slow, now speedy, now ratcheting up, now a solo. Then I mentioned Martha Graham's book, Blood, Memory, and Autobiography, that I looked at when I was trying to find some language I could use in structuring the essays and maybe dividing them. So I didn't find my book structure there, but I found these words from Martha Graham. There are always ancestral footsteps behind me, pushing me when I am creating a new dance and gestures are flowing through me, this movement. And I'll just read the very end of my essay. Ultimately, I realized that my book is a series of gestural movements beginning from its spine, the tree, an old photograph to place us, to bring us to now. Though the whole book is a weaving of this time into that time, the way we carry the past with us in our bones, in our cells. There has to be movement and stretching, shapes, a direction. I thought of mudras, which I learned from studying Bharatanatyam and Kuchipudi, 2 styles of Indian classical dance. Anjali mudra is one used often at the end of yoga and dance classes, right? Palms pressed together, a balancing. So much of writing is what has been cut away. A book is a series of choices. It is what remains. Working this way in both dance and writing takes time to feel your way into the structure by sound. I look for my glasses on a morning bedside table cluttered with books, a glass of water, pens, a lamp, hand lotion, a weighted lavender eye pillow. How can you find your glasses if you can't see? You feel your way. How am I doing for time? Am I okay? All right. This is from one other craft essay I wrote for poets and writers called Breaking Genre. And in this, I talk a little bit about how I use fiction. Oops, there goes my. In writing about neurodiversity, institutional racism, and sexual harassment, I used excerpts of published stories of mine to offer a counter narrative and voice, what the nonfiction narrator could not say in her essay. In nonfiction, I was recounting an event. In fiction, I could go to a distressing place without having to explain it. I looked for places where the language needed a different pitch. For example, when I was describing mania. I wanted to return to the ocean. I wanted to get cooked. I wrote on the walls in charcoal because all of the other surfaces could move and then I wouldn't find them. I might not find you. Stories allowed me to say what I could not have otherwise said, at least at the time of writing. In the period in which I wrote those stories, I could not have written as nonfiction about the reality of being diagnosed with manic depression, adjusting to psychiatric meds that had a severe side effect of aphasia and cognitive dampening. They said, take this pill, this one or that one too before sleep, take 4 in the morning or at night. It's best to avoid alcohol. These things, they said, happen sometime. There is no relief. And at the end of this essay, this comes back to either feel or so touch or sound. I read my work aloud when I'm working on it, when I'm revising. My husband read aloud, "This is one way to dance," when I was going through proofs. The sentences have to land. The sounds have to hit a certain note. I'm thinking of when you tune a violin and the string next to it needs to vibrate. That is how I work in most any genre when I'm most true to myself. I don't think about labels. I don't care about what to call it, what it will be called. We are called. I listen for the sound. And I'll pass it on there.
Hi, I'm Gina Frangello. It is just a crazy joy to see all these faces. And Megan and I go way back, and I haven't seen her in a really long time, so I'm kind of giddy. Thank you, Janine, for putting this together, and thank you for hosting us. I am pretty obsessed with body writing. It is what I have done from the beginning of starting to write, which was when I was 4 years old. Um, I've never not written, and I've never understood how one could write without the body being prominent in the work. So early on, I was often told that my work was too sexual, too graphic, too this, too that. And it was always kind of surprising because in many ways, my work was actually less embodied then and more psychological, about issues of sex, illness, death, pregnancy, all of these different things. I used actions of the body as a way to explore psychology. I still do that, but as time went on, I think my work became much more actually rooted in the body. I started to realize that to a certain extent I was writing from the outside in, as though looking at, as though observing, as though commenting on, and that my interest lay in writing from the inside out. And what I find, I think this is true in both fiction and nonfiction, is that a lot of work in the mainstream, a lot of like commercially published work, a lot of all work, you know, writers are great at empathy, writers are great at psychology, but sometimes we forget that the character has a body. And what happens when we forget that the character has a body is that we are, whether we intend it or not, writing in a homogenized normative body that the reader then imagines because it has not been otherwise specified. And as somebody who has taken care of my very elderly disabled parents for a period of about 8 years, as somebody who has been through breast cancer, a bilateral mastectomy, chemo, chronic pain, a hip replacement, you know, I've lost friends, of course, to cancer, as I'm sure everybody has. I've been through pregnancy, a difficult pregnancy, also miscarriage. The body is how we experience the world. You know, we can't get out of the body. And so if we just say, for example, like, we had sex and it was amazing, what does that mean? It doesn't have a meaning. It's just words that are imprecise. And so the reader just will automatically fill in the most typically portrayed situation. Oh, I guess, you know, they had missionary sex. Maybe the woman was on top. They both had an orgasm. Everything was great, you know, and that's not what it may mean to everyone. When you say, I have a headache, my head hurt. Okay, the reader understands what that means, but what does that feel like? And so it brings us to a kind of, there's a fundamental separation between language and experience. So no matter what I say about my headache, I can't give you my headache, but I can get a lot closer than saying my head hurt. I might feel like there's an ice pick through one of my temples. I might feel like there's a strobing behind my eyes. So we get there through metaphor, through this is like this and not like that. Um, and we get there through specificity. Now, I'm not saying, of course, that everybody or even most people, I don't do it most of the time either, is necessarily going to feel like you need to give a complete, detailed, blow by blow description of every time somebody has any form of illness or anytime anybody has any form of sexuality or desire. Um, if we wrote everything about anything, we'd have 5 phone books by the end of a hour-long experience in life. So we're always curating, we're always figuring out what is the most important thing. So, for example, my third book is a novel called A Life in Men. And it's written about a woman traveler with cystic fibrosis. And sort of thematically, I guess you could sum the book up by saying that she is trying to live her life on as big a canvas as possible in a limited period of time. She's going to a lot of different countries, having a lot of different experiences, pushing herself, pushing her health. She experiences a situation where she bleeds from the mouth where she can't, and the nose and cannot stop. She experiences a lot of different types of sexuality. She experiences infertility, all of these things in addition to the daily physical therapy treatments of having cystic fibrosis or having oxygen with you and all of these different things. So of course I had to research like crazy. I do not have cystic fibrosis. I lived with a woman who had it, but by the time I was writing the book, she had died. And my character was born in 1968, the year I was born, the year my friend was born. And so there were not, in fact, a lot of people from 1968 who had had cystic fibrosis who could walk me through this experience. Most of them had passed away. And so I did research like a crazy person for years. But not all that research goes into the book, of course. We're not writing a medical reference book, but the curation of what is enough that you can put the reader into the character's body rather than just describing something kind of from a clinical medical distance. And I realized that I'd been doing that in many ways, in terms of writing sexuality too. At some point, I was a fiction writer from the ages of 4 to say 32 exclusively. And when I was in my early 30s, I also started to write short form nonfiction. Much of my short form nonfiction centered around caregiving my parents. My parents had unruly, unwieldy bodies. If you don't have one now, you will. Health is always a temporary state. We in the United States like to imagine that if you do everything right, if you're a good person, if you have good habits, that perfect health, glowing perfect health with no pain, no disability, no illness is the normative state of life. No other culture, I think, in the world has that perspective. We in America moralize health. And so a lot of people are ashamed of their unruly bodies. Thankfully, we have a lot of writers out there countering this right now. We have Lydia Yuknevic's Chronology of Water. We have Roxane Gay's Hunger. We have older writers, Mary Gateskill, Two Girls Fat and Thin, or Bad Behavior. We have Marguerite Duras, The Lover. Megan mentioned Lehman and his work. And all of this has really only started to come about in any wide scale way in the last 50 years. In particular, women and people of color and queer people writing about our bodies, it's been an even slower trickle. Often our bodies were represented by other people, traditionally straight white men in a culture of some kind that had power, England, the United States, and we're defining what it meant to be in another body. And that's obviously like the most obvious example I can think of is a lot of women, for example, reading Lady Chatterley's Lover and being like, why isn't that my sexuality? And then Erica Jong comes along, and slowly we start to reclaim what is the truth of our own physical form. And we think about what we're forbidden to say. Most people will think, well, I don't want to write about stuffing a deep abdominal wound with gauze and pulling it out like a slimy worm that feels like a piece of large intestine or small intestine. But that's the reality when your mother has just had a surgery that took out part of her colon and now is waiting temporarily to see if her colon can be restored. And you live upstairs and you're her primary caregiver. And at that point, it's still externalized, even though you're taking part in it. Flash forward to my body becoming the unruly body. And then we think about how often people can write about one thing at a time. So you can go out and you can find books about cancer. You can find lots of books about people who have had breast cancer. You can go out and find lots of books about people who have written about their sexual lives. You can find lots of books written about people who've been through pregnancy. You don't often find the intersection of all these things layering and cascading upon each other, and then also intersecting with the identity of the particular person to whom these things are happening. And all of that forms a complex stew. It's all inextricable. So one person's experience of having that great sex or having that mastectomy is not the same as another's. I think we have so much shame still in this culture around bodies that do anything other than either thrive constantly or recover neatly. My husband, Rob Roberge, has a memoir called Liar. And in it, he has a line that says, the arc of mental illness does not conform to a redemption narrative. He has bipolar. He also is in recovery from addiction. A lot of things do not conform to the arc of a redemption narrative. Terminal illness, chronic pain, disability. People, when they ask you, how do you feel? How is it going? They want to hear better. It's going better. But what if it's not going better? And so there's an obligation to tell these stories. I think, for example, a lot of it is imagination too. So much of what I've been saying, other than talking about A Life in Men, maybe applies to personal narrative, to memoir, to short form nonfiction, to reclaiming our own bodies. But it also has to do with who's permitted in an imagined space. So for centuries, men have been imagining the female body. In the early 2000s, I, with Chris Mazza and my former business partner, Stacey Bierlein, and Kat Meads, edited an anthology called Men Undressed, Women Write.
Gina, did we lose you?
She's frozen for me.
Okay. All right. Gina, hi, we love you. Okay, we're going to pause. We were talking about Men Undressed. Janine, should we tag over to you?
Sure.
Okay, great.
All right. Thanks, Megan.
Sure.
Well, first of all, just yeah, it's just a thrill to be here. This is a topic near and dear to me. And I think maybe it was you, Megan, who said that we can't escape the body, or we're in a body, and that one of you smart people said that. And I think that one of the reasons this topic is so near and dear to me is that I really did escape living in the body for a very large portion of my life. Hi, Gina. You're back. Yay. What should we do? Do you want to finish your thought, Gina?
I don't even know where I cut off. Was I frozen for?
Oh, no.
Oh, no, we lost you again.
Okay. So how about if I just keep going and then
I
we'll
know.
come to Gina when I'm done. Anyway, as a person, and I loved what Gina was saying about shame, and all of the ways that we, especially in this culture, place shame on a body that doesn't conform. And I just want to add to that bucket the shame of a body that's been violated. And so, you know, as someone who experienced childhood sexual abuse and really wasn't able to live in my body for a large portion of my life, the idea of being able to write from the body, yeah, I think trying to wrap my mind around that when I was younger was completely out of reach. And I want to give a quote. Fanny House says, "One way to understand your own condition is to write something and spend a long time revising it. In revising, you teach yourself. You find your own information buried in your body. It is still alive until you are not." And I feel like for me, that truth of the story that lives in the body, the story that I could not tell, the story that I could not write, was such a force. And it was also the story that was an impediment to being able to fully live. And so but the idea of writing from the body also requires feeling the body. And, you know, that Robert Frost says, no feeling in the writer, no feeling in the reader. And I feel like there is a degree to which writing the body requires it requires the sensory experience of the language. It's, you know, and there is a certain yeah, there's a cellular memory there. So what I wanted to do is just read a little bit. I eventually, around after a long time of living and recovering, was able to write the story of my childhood and the recovery from my childhood. My memoir, The Part That Burns, came out earlier this year in February. And I just want to read it's probably about 3 or 4 minutes long. This is the part of the book where the narrator is actually, for the first time, really confronting the fact that she's beginning to live again in her body. And it's actually comes with a lot of challenges. It's not that easy to suddenly be feeling everything again. So there are 2 young children at this time, a baby and a 3-year-old or something. And so, and she's just had a big fight with her husband. Okay, so I'm just going to read this section. There is more, though. More than a single bright Sunday in November, one pretty student teacher with impossibly smooth hair and a wide smile. What happened before that day was how I came apart after Max was born, how the pieces of me pulled away from each other like poorly laid sod on parched Wyoming soil. Even as I put myself back together, those pieces never fit the same as before. Max had colic, wanted only me, so I held him 24 hours a day, tied to my body in his baby bundler, and vacuumed the living room for hours because it was the only thing other than nursing that soothed him. If anyone else, including his father, grandparents, early childhood teachers, neighbors, grocery clerks, even Sophie, so much as looked at Max, he might cry. And I blamed myself for his colic because of that scary woman at the incest therapy group, the moaner who threatened to bring a gun and shoot us all in that awful fluorescent basement. Bang, 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 she said, cocking her finger. I brought my unborn son with me into that den of despair and wrath and goneness. I carried him there inside my spoiled body, week after week, to endure what was beyond anyone's ability to endure. I did that to my perfect boy, and now I could never, ever take it back. That first year, Max cried and nursed until my nipples bled and scabbed and bled again. I contracted a raging case of mastitis. A storm raged in me, spiraled right through fall into winter. Snow fell, snow melted. When new growth poked through the mud, so too did memories, groves and thickets of the past pushing into the present. Spring warmed to summer and summer fell to autumn. Winter in its cruelty came again. Now it was not just Mafia, my stepfather, and my childhood self who intruded, but also fresh knowledge of the woman I had allowed myself to become. During those long winter days, snowed in with 2 small children, I slowly recalled things from my recent past, incredulous things, like that stretchy black bodysuit I wore for John on our first wedding anniversary at the Hotel Lux when Sophie was not quite 6 weeks old. My lumpy postpartum body stuffed into that tube of Lycra with its sexy crotch hole for my still raw episiotomy scar from the jagged knife wound where the anonymous male doctor had sliced all the way through the tough muscle of my vaginal wall and every other layer of muscle to follow until the blade came out the other side, leaving not only a gash, but a swollen bruise the size of a grapefruit. That's what John had said the day we got home from the hospital with our firstborn. What he had said when I asked him to look down there because it hurt so much I couldn't breathe. What he said before he turned white and slid down the wall, the size of a grapefruit. Time and again that second winter with Max when he was 1 year old and still fragile, highly sensitive, the book said. It all came flooding back, that bodysuit and firm mattress, my young husband desperate to come like a freight train. 6 weeks is a long time. Are you okay? Me, floating out and away. I became so electric that winter that if Sophie so much as nipped at me, one little bite that barely hurt, just an attempt really, not even a real bite, I would throw her favorite book across the room and smash its binding. That March, our cat brought in fleas that chose me as their human host, red bites up and down my ankles and calves, diatomaceous earth, chemicals will kill you, coating our wood floors, clinging to the soles of our feet, sticking to our clothes, grinding into our sheets. Finally, the Sunday morning when Sophie eyed her baby brother in his adorable striped rugby suit, pink and blue, he was 18 months and walking now in that teetering and tentative way that toddlers walk. So fragile you can blow them down with one strong puff. Sophie watched quietly and long as he toddled his way through a shaft of light on the oak floor. Then she shoved him hard into the corner of the banister. The edges of the room darkened around me, closed into a shadowy tunnel through which I lunged to slap my firstborn daughter across the cheek. I watched my handprint bloom like a hibiscus. I wanted to die. What happened next was swift and irrevocable, its own kind of doorway. You know, I lied, I told John in the middle of another fight about sex, how angry he was over not getting it, angry that I had 2 legs and should know how to use them, angry that I was, as he now said, frigid. I lied and lied, I said again as Max nursed greedily with his whole body. I never had 9 orgasms with you back in the beginning. I never even had one, and I still haven't. I thought of my therapist, what she said about women and sex. You could at least try, I said meanly, slow down and use your hands. But that's not all. God, he was a hard worker, my young husband, a 2-hour round trip commute to an inner city school. By day, 2 shifts a week at the night school too, walking through the door at 10 o'clock for what? Laundry. Although with Max, at least, we had a diaper service. I demanded that now that I demanded things. Still, diapers were nothing in a sea of everything, and whatever else needed doing, John did it. He did. But that didn't stop me from telling him how I'd been pretending. It didn't stop me from pushing him away with all the force I could muster. So, thanks for listening to that. It's kind of the turning point and the embodiment of the narrator in this.
Janine, what page did you read from? I don't think I got there yet.
It is kind of a little bit after the middle of the book. Yeah, it's the turning point. I was reading on the screen, but it's in the section called Open Water.
Okay.
Which starts on page, my glasses, starts on page 112.
Okay, thank you.
It was good to hear you read it aloud. I read the book a while ago when we did our first event, and it's always different to hear someone read it aloud.
I feel like what I, in a way, was trying to capture there is something that you were talking about, Gina, which is this idea of when it's all cascading together. You know, the wounds and the motherhood and the nursing and the trauma and the sex and the exhaustion and um, yeah, just that really messy, complex, multi-layered reality of living in a body.
Yeah. I remember one time when my mother first got sick in around 2006, and I had a newborn and I was nursing, and my life was running to the hospital and kind of spoon feeding my mother, who was in and out of consciousness, and then running home and nursing my youngest child. And it was like living inside of a metaphor, I mean, it was just sort of like the cycle of life and that being stuck in the middle. And sometimes when you're so stuck in that kind of place, it's almost like you forget that you have a body too, where you're always giving to one body or to another. And I think that
Mm.
is a place that it's easy for women to get stuck, particularly in middle age. Like there's starting to be a much stronger narrative about what it is to be a young woman in a body. Whether it's like Melissa Phoebus's Girlhood, there's a much greater acceptance of telling the stories of young womanhood. But we still live in a culture where after you get married and have children, women's inner lives and physical lives are assumed to sort of just then remain in stasis forever or become invisible. And that was one of the things that I was really trying to wrestle with my memoir, was what it is to be in a middle-aged body. And so what you were reading reminded me of was sort of coming home after a mastectomy, and that my then lover, now husband, and I had been so depressed in about the 6 weeks leading up to my surgery that we had basically been unable to be sexual. We were just freaked out. And I think in particular, he was just so afraid that I was going to disappear that he couldn't get aroused. And so we came home and we had found out that the pathology report came back positively, very good, as good as you can have if you have breast cancer. And at that point, I had a metal expander in my chest. They would inject it with saline and so forth when you would go in to try to do your reconstruction eventually. And I had these drains hanging from holes in the sides of my body. And we ended up having incredibly passionate sex, like with my drains pinned up around a lanyard and this crazy expander inside my chest, and like my scars still raw. And it was just one of those moments where I was like, from now on, it will never be only this or that. It will always be both things, that you take your body's scars, like you were talking about with sexual abuse. You take your body's history into every experience you then have in that body. And it's not enough on the page.
I'm thinking now, and this might be a little too meta, so somebody feel free to jump in and redirect me, but how whatever we're experiencing in the body at any given moment colors how we take in information, or how we read a text, but also how we maybe even having an experience like listening to this panel conversation. To wit, my mother's been having some health challenges as she lives in another state. She got me an Apple Watch so that we can connect so like her health stuff connects to me immediately. And all while we've been sitting here having this conversation, my son forgot to take his snacks to camp. And so my watch has been, brrr, but it like physically just on me, like, mom, bring me food, mom, bring me food. And I'm sitting here like, I'm working, dude, that's not going to happen right now. Like you have to wait. And then, we can have a whole nother conversation on motherhood and how that, like what that does to the body in particular and how that influences the text. But of course that has me now like thinking, because that's in my body, like on my body right now. And then that makes me think about technology and then what happens when we connect social media, like into chips with our eyeballs. Like I'm very into like weird secret agent sci-fi stuff as well too. But I've been taking in this conversation just through the lens of my child having immediate access to my body, because I keep feeling him and I can feel the anxiety of how I'm being pulled between these two worlds at this particular moment. So again, it makes me think about like that on a bigger level of like, say, Gina, how did I read your most recent book? When I was on the road traveling and living in 4 different time zones and completely an insomniac and not sleeping, right? So like how did that lack of sleep and what was happening in my body influence how I took in your text, right? So I'm thinking about this in terms of the folks who might be listening to this conversation right now. What's going on in your body? Is there pain? Is there joy? Are you gonna get laid right afterwards and you're excited about that? Are you gonna eat something delicious, right? And how does that influence the like where this conversation is going? Somebody should take this from me right now, because as we see, like I'm running over here to Nashville while we're talking.
Megan, I love that. And that I'm thinking of, well, Janine, I have this underlined in your book. I've been reading very slowly, whatever it is I'm reading, but it takes so long to become anything, especially yourself. That's on page 85. Just and your Fanny Howe quote, because I was thinking about the essay that I think is most important to me in my book is one that only exists. It's the last one I added. It's about going to Burning Man. And that experience was so challenging because I wasn't prepared. And Megan, it exists because I read a draft of it. And when I was at Ragdale, Michelle Morano was there and she remembered it. So later when I saw her years later and she said, did you finish that essay? And I said, no, I was stuck in it. There was all of this drama in being there. But the most important part of that essay for me was, and she read this once when I did, it was just, if I am cold, there is almost nothing I will not do to get warm again, including breaking into a strange car close to midnight. And I'm so grateful to her for just kind of saying, I mean, being interested enough to remember. And, it took me so long to get to the end of that essay, that I realized later that maybe it should have been at the end of the book, because really I had to understand something about myself that I didn't understand for many of the years that I was working on the essay. And that was really a bodily thing. It was just about why I went. It was, I was a phoenix. I wanted to burn. I was a circle of stars, silver in the night sky. It was me. I was the spectacle in the desert I had traveled so far to see. I had kind of blown up my life, or it had blown up. I'd lost my job. And, but it was interesting because in my head, it was like, okay, this is a dramatic setting, maybe, or a cliche, right? Burning Man. But, and I also had to think, and my mother texted me called me right before this panel and said, I can't get in. So I don't know if she's in or not, but I paused. I hesitated before putting that essay in. I think that's one that she hates. Because it's different than some of the other, it's the kind of thing that, at least my mother would not want to read, or would not want anyone else she knows to read, which is maybe why it's a good essay. I don't know.
I think that's certainly part of the conversation about writing from the body is other people reading from the body, and people who don't want to know, like whether they're people who we are intimate with, have intimate relationships with, our parents are
lovers, our spouses, our children, our friends. But just even also, and Gina was getting at this, I was really grateful for this, Gina, just the bigger conversation of wider readership saying, okay, it's too much. It's too graphic. Don't go there. I don't want to know that much. Like la 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 la. This is subject matter I don't want to read about. Well, 9 times out of 10, the subject matter that we don't want to read about is the subject matter that we do need to be engaging in a wider cultural and political dialogue about. Like anywhere from, we need to know that we're not alone in it, all the way up to the fact that there needs to be systemic policy change around the particular subject matter, right? Like Janine, I'm thinking of your book in particular. We have to be able to talk about childhood sexual assault and what's happening, because that's how we're going to stop it.
Yeah, it's what you're saying is real though, and it certainly was a barrier for me when you live in a world where, of course, it's fair for people to say, "Ew, I don't want to read about that," and then also, the publishing industry. It's like, oh, we don't need any more of those stories. It's like on every list of like, don't give us any more of that. So just to go ahead and find a way to persevere, would and that's only like whether it's not literally this, but it can't help but exacerbate that sort of humiliation or shame of like, oh yeah, this is a story nobody wants. In fact, one agent actually said, oh, I don't, it's really beautiful writing, but I don't like to see a child abused so early in the story. And I remember thinking, yeah, I didn't really like living that either.
I mean, what helped you persevere yourself with the book and with getting it published?
I just, Sejal, I just like had to do it. And this is kind of back to that Fanny Howe quote that the story lives in you, and certain stories are so formative and so powerful. They have so much power over you that to do what she discussed and actually work through that revision process, for me, the therapy wasn't so much in the telling, but in the revising, like in wrangling that story into something artistic was transformative. And so I needed that story not to press itself on every other thing that I was ever trying to write, which it was otherwise doing. It's like, nope, I have to give this story its due. And if 4 people, end up reading it or whatever, but I had to do the work of it. Yeah. Just as an artist, it was mandatory to just finally do that so I could really look at other things. Because it's like what we've been saying all along, the body, you probably know the book, The Body Keeps the Score, but the body really does keep the score. The body knows. Yeah. So
it's also true that for all the people who may not choose to read about certain topics, and that's totally fine, there are so many readers and writers out there who are self-censoring in their lives and who thought they were the only one having X experience. And I think, literature has been proven to increase empathy. And it doesn't have the same effect of reading in a newspaper, this person was arrested for domestic violence or for sexually abusing their child, or, reading an article about cancer and sexuality. Like, journalism is different than literature, where we really go in and, like we were talking about, from the inside out. And I think, any of us who have written bodily centered work, like, you hear from people who are unbelievably relieved to see something on the page that they thought couldn't be said, or that they thought they would be the only one who would say that, and therefore they'd be vilified. And it's all about normalizing the things that we somehow tell ourselves are not normal, whereas all these things about the body are normal.
And sharing an emotional experience, like they do research where they hook up MRIs to people's brains when they're reading, and like the emotions that we feel, which I think is a miracle, really, truly, like, talk about science fiction, that we can read these symbols on a page and it can create this entire emotional landscape in the body, and I think that's why it's so different from journalism, because, 2 people are meeting across time and space, through symbols, sharing like an emotional experience. So I do think, Yeah, that's pretty magical.
Gina, I'm looking forward to reading Burn It Down. I haven't yet, but I did read that review, and I had a visceral response to that. I don't know if
I mean, you know, when you write about things that women have been taught we're not allowed to say, there are going to be people who do not want to hear it, as we just talked about. And that's fine. Every single person who reads a text brings themselves and their own, baggage and embodiment to that text. And
I
one,
had a hard time reading that, though.
It wasn't really a review of Gina's book. I love Gina's book so much. I just
No, I mean, it seemed, I don't know, I guess I haven't written enough reviews to know, but it seemed very much about the writer.
it often is for women memoirists. It often is a review of the writer's life in a different way than what happens.
Well, and it seemed very much about the reviewer,
Mhm.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, it certainly is also a whole different topic, like the way one prominent piece of writing can sort of shape a cultural discourse. Because the great thing that came out of that, because my book was billed as a rage-fueled memoir, is that now I get to talk about women's rage all the time. Everyone wants to ask me about it. And most of the time, I mean, no other review framed it that way. Readers who read it don't frame it that way. But I am happy to have a platform to talk about the fact that women's rage needs to have also a place on the page.
That's great.
And that we are allowed a whole spectrum of emotions, and we are allowed a whole spectrum of existence. I don't think, for example, that many men who write memoir are asked constantly how everyone in their life responded to reading their memoir. And, what will your children think about your, calling on Nick Flynn, whatever, like, do you get asked that? Like, I mean, I don't think men really get asked that. And maybe I'm wrong, but I did tour around with my husband, who wrote also a very embodied book, a very sexual book, a book about addiction, about mental illness. And he was not getting those questions, but women always will, because it's our job to make other people happy. It's our job to be likable at all moments, and likable meaning the sort of dominant patriarchal idea of what likability entails.
There's this great Frank Chimera essay. He's a designer, and he said that after you make the thing and you put the thing into the world, it doesn't belong to you anymore. It belongs to the people who carry it. And just like how loaded, when you do write from the body, like how loaded assumptions become, because like people step into your work with everything that is all of their own life experience and everything that they are pre-programmed with and everything that they understand about your body. And then how does that get pushed back against, right? Like, I just taught your book, Gina, and I don't think like rage was not a part of, rage was a part of it insofar as rage is a completely logical response to everything that is happening to the world right now, specifically gender and misogyny, but not like, here is my bloody rage, like blood coming out of my ears fury kind of a thing, but just actually rational response.
Yeah, I mean, that's a question that's been being posed, I think, for so long in women's writing. It used to be more like, is insanity the only sane response to a woman hating world, right? And so if we look at early feminist literature, we often have characters who unravel, who walk into the sea, who throw themselves in front of a train, like self-destruction, madness as kind of the reaction to misogyny. And I think that, if we have evolved to a place where women are getting angry at things outside ourselves instead of internalizing all our anger as self-destruction, that's progress. And it's not to say that anger is the place that we want to live as a society, but for too long, I think too many marginalized people have taken sort of the hatred and oppression of society and put it into our own bodies and basically annihilated ourselves for the patriarchal system. Like they didn't even have to do it. We're jumping over our ourselves to do it our own selves. And, that has to end. And if a certain amount of unapologetic rage is a part of that, so be it.
So be it.
I'm interested in how, so talking about writing from the body is in what we experience inside of it. And then talking about writing from the body is how other people look at it. Can we get into, because I was hearing all three of you talk about this, but just can we get into a little bit about how it influences form and structure? Because I also teach Sejal's essay, Feel Your Way in Poets and Writers, and just like trying to figure out the structure of the work through the body. And Gina, I know that you were doing a lot of I'm just going to, for lack of a better term, say non-traditional narrative structure within the last book. And I'm really interested in thinking about how, as we're trying to tell stories that haven't been traditionally told, we're also trying to think about how to tell them in ways that are just so much as subject matter.
Oh my God, sorry.
But just so much about like how subject matter is. Oh my God, did we just go? Are we going?
Oh yeah,
it's totally okay.
Are we blowing over? I can stop asking questions. I just really like the three of you a lot.
I think this is important. And yeah, sorry, it's Blow Your House Down. I said the wrong title.
It's okay.
And the part that burns and blow your house. No, it's important.
Okay.
It's important.
Okay. Yeah, but I mean, just traditional narrative structures. I mean, that was. I mean, I want to just piggyback off of Gina talking about how so much of our literature is coming from straight white men. But what does it mean when we're trying to blow up form as well too, and using the body to build through that?
I just want to say to that, Megan, that I absolutely could not tell my story or write my book in a traditional narrative arc form.
Yeah.
I tried it. I actually did it, and it just didn't work. And I had to use a non-traditional form. I ended up using fragments and an elliptical back and forth form. It really had to mirror the experience of the way that trauma spirals in the body and the way we in our lives spiral through and away from and back to and away from, especially a formative trauma, as we move through time. It's not linear. In other words, it's just not that linear chronological narrative arc. So
you all are familiar with I was just going to talk about Pam Houston's essay Corn Maze, which talks about exactly that. I think, the nonlinear form, the fact that trauma doesn't conform to first this, then that. So
But Gina, what book did you just mention, or what?
The essay Corn Maze by Pam Houston. And I think it's one of the most masterful essays out there, where a personal essay meets craft essay, and content and form are so in dialogue with each other. But it's largely about nonlinearity, free association, the connective tissue between things that is more emotional than structural. I definitely, like Janine, did not use a very traditional structure in my memoir, because I feel like, that isn't how, if we talk about like the way we experience things in our bodies, like you're just often in something that happened long ago. You're often just like thrown right back into it. You could feel it in your stomach. You can feel, Megan talked about, she could feel those 5 hours, like right now, years later. And so it's not, the French feminists would say this is not, that women needed to invent a new language to write our bodies. And they were saying that in the 70s. And while there was a lot that they had to say that was sort of passé, because they were definitely talking about kind of like upper middle class white intellectual women when they were talking. But there is a lot of truth to the fact that traditional narrative doesn't meet the needs of stories that are not the dominant narrative, that are not narratives of reassurance, but narratives of disruption.
Something I tried to do with my book that I guess most of my readers did not like was I had them in sections, and the sections were, and this ended up getting taken out, but it was American studies, cultural studies, women's studies, and I can't remember what the other one was. But because I area studies, I was really pushing back on school, like what we're told, so which essays were going to be in American studies, right? And what if you're all of these things? What's going to be in women's studies? What's going to be in cultural studies? But I found that too many readers, I think, didn't get what I was doing, and maybe that's okay. Like maybe I had spent so long in graduate school and as a professor that I realized, even though I took that stuff out, that I was talking back to school. So I
Can that be its own essay? Because I would like that. I want all of the nonlinear. I want all of the new ways to tell things. And I work with memoirists and essayists in these year-long classes, right, where we build the books from the ground up, and that's constantly the biggest conversation. I don't want to tell this in a traditional way. But is that going to sell? And I think so much of this, like, do y'all remember? It was just like 5 minutes ago, but it feels like several centuries when Elizabeth Warren was running for president, and there was like constantly well, can she be elected? And it was like, well, if we vote for her, she can. And it's that same thing. Like, there's this pervasive idea that we have to write in a more traditional narrative structure, and we've got like, I love being here with the three of you because I know you're all exploding that notion. And I as a reader and as an educator, I want more of those. I want that explosion.
And I also want to just throw out too that I feel like the publishing industry makes mistakes constantly about what the market really wants. So, I mean, they like to play it safe because, it's a risky business, and a lot of books don't make money. The vast majority of books don't make money. But if you think about the story of something like Chronology of Water, and everybody listening to this panel has probably heard of, if not read, The Chronology of Water by Lydia Yuknavik, and that book was rejected all over New York, 30 more, than that rejected, because people thought nobody wants this. It ended up coming out on Hawthorne, and it's a book about having a stillborn child, a book about bisexuality, a book about addiction, the body, desire, and Hawthorne Press put it out, and it kind of became an instant cult classic. I mean, it exploded Lydia's career. And so what were these marketing departments talking about when they thought nobody wanted to read that book? Everybody wanted to read that book.
Yeah, you go.
Oh, I was just going to say that I feel like the hardest thing is to trust your own sense of things. Not that we don't need outside readers or editors. I mean, obviously we do, but I feel like, I took some comments from the blind readers I had, went through peer review at a university press. And I think that in some ways it was a mistake to try to make what I was doing legible. I realized later, I didn't know where they were coming from. One person was an ethnomusicologist, and she later wrote to me on Twitter and said, I was hoping that my comments didn't mess you up, because I was coming from this very particular, having studied the South Asian culture and blah, blah, blah. And I thought, it probably did. Because you can't respond to everybody's, every response has a I don't want to say it's valid exactly, but I guess it is, right? I mean, it has, but I don't know that helps you tell the best story or the most important story to you, right? Someone can say, oh, well, I get lost in this. Well, maybe you want a little bit of lostness.
I just want to say quickly that, to that feedback that I got many times from agents about the narrative arc, I want to give a hat tip to Jane Allison, whose book Meander, Spiral, Explode. which is on nonlinear narrative form. So for those who don't know it, I highly recommend it. And she actually, just comes right out and says what we're not pointing to right now, that the traditional narrative arc is very patriarchal and male. And I'm not to say that I don't enjoy a great, narrative arc myself sometimes, but the idea of the rising tension climax and
Oh yeah, right.
right. And
No,
she's like,
it's
come
so
on,
like ridiculously male, and we're so used to it, and it was taught in school.
No, we
and
just accept it, and like, and then so she has a really beautiful paragraph unpacking that right in the introduction. Like, come on, let's take a closer look at that, and also like, hey, women friends, is that how you experience sex exactly? So yeah, I think it's really important to experiment and be open and push our narrative forms.
If we can just, I'm making a list now, but if we can just like be building the syllabus a little bit off of this conversation. We've got Corn Maze by Pam Houston. We've got Meander, Spiral, Explore. I want to add, Randon Billings Noble has a new anthology coming out called Harp in the Stars, an anthology of lyric essays. So I want to offer that into this conversation too. But something that's really striking to me is how many of us here, and I would wager many of you listening as well too, have been told no by others, right? Have been told no by agents or by editors or by other readers or within the workshop space. So just as a teacher myself, just a couple of things I want to lift up for other teachers is just being really thoughtful when your writers in that space are coming at work that is about the body, how that is going to influence form. And maybe it's going to be in ways that are very untraditional. And so how do we talk about that? So just as tools, I want to offer you the critical response methodology by Liz Lerman. I want to offer you Craft in the Real World by Matthew Salasis. And I want to offer you the Anti-Racist Writing Workshop by Felicia Rose Chavez, which are all texts that have been incredibly helpful for me in understanding some of the bigger discussions that we have so that this work can live in the world. We need it. We need, like, let that be a takeaway from this conversation. We need this work about the body. We are all actively looking for it and searching for it. So.
Thank you for mentioning those texts, Megan. I realized that a lot of what I was doing, because some of those essays and stories were written when I was in an MFA program, 20 something years ago, what was about kind of pushing back and unlearning some of that. And in some cases, like, taking what I had straightened my work out in some way, letting it get weak again.
Yeah.
Just also like in terms of when we think about how most people think about like so-called experimental writing and the explosion of it in the 60s, 70s, 80s, mostly, I mean, we had examples like Kathy Acker, but mostly by men, and mostly with an idea that like who is speaking is not important. Author and characterization are less important than, experimentation with language. And I think what women and people of color are doing with more innovative work is centering character again, centering identity again within the context of formal innovation. And that it was almost as though if you were writing deep psychological characterization, that was silly, for a while in sort of academia and the postmodern, writing seminars and so forth. And I think, formal innovation, when you're also writing identity, when you're also writing to explode myths about certain identities, is very different than formal innovation when your identity is assumed to be the organic norm.
Yeah. That's so important, Gina.
It's something I've been thinking about with fiction too, right? We've got, I feel like it's, white men and some women are given a lot of leeway with, within auto fiction, where I feel like there's less, maybe it's seen as trying to, like, it's not created. It's not fiction if a writer of color is doing it. It's just autobiographical.
And it's really weird too. When I think about autofiction, I also think about the way that like Rachel Cusk was so demonized for her memoirs about motherhood, about divorce. But then when writing it as autofiction, has been hailed and acclaimed. And so how we process different genres and when people are allowed to say things versus when they are not is really interesting. You know, that's been a case study that's been particularly, you know, made an impact on me in terms of how we're processing these things.
Well, and I feel like what kind of space women are allowed in different genres. You know, I feel like really taking up space, domestic space, motherhood, not having children.
Yes. Are we over time? I think.
Yes,
So
we're over time. Take up space. That's it. That's the space. That's the.
I'm just going to I'm going to take a photo because I can't remember how to do this with my computer. I'm too old. All right. It's so nice to meet you guys.
You too.
Thank
you.
Thank you.
What
Thanks
an
so much,
Bye.
everyone.
Congratulations,
Thank
Gina.
Thank
Bye,
you.
everyone.
Blow your house down.